October 14, 1943. 28,000 feet above occupied Germany, the sky was so clear you could see forever, and B-17 bomber pilot Lieutenant James Henderson thought it was the kind of perfect flying weather that made you forget people were trying to kill you. His flying fortress, a beast of aluminum and steel they'd nicknamed Hell's Angel, droned along in tight formation with 36 other B-17s, their engines creating a sound like rolling thunder that the German farmers below could probably hear for miles. Henderson was 24 years old, married for 8 months before shipping out, and this was his 14th mission over Europe. He'd checked off his superstitions that morning like he always did, touched the photo of his wife Sarah twice, worn his lucky socks, and eaten exactly half his breakfast because eating a full meal before a bombing run felt like tempting fate. The mission briefing had been standard stuff, the kind of routine operation where you bomb a ball-bearing factory in Schweinfurt, avoid the flak zones marked on the maps, and get home in time for a cold beer and a hot meal. Everything was going exactly according to plan until the German anti-aircraft guns opened up. The flak burst around them like black flowers blooming in the sky, each explosion sending shrapnel screaming through the air at speeds that could tear through aluminum like paper. Henderson held the bomber steady, trusting the formation to protect them, watching the other B-17s maintain their positions even as the sky filled with smoke and death. Then their plane shuddered. The kind of shake that makes every rivet groan and every crew member grab onto something solid. Lieutenant Morrison, their navigator, never even had time to scream because the shrapnel that punched through the nose section hit him in the chest and killed him instantly, and co-pilot Danichin took shrapnel in his left shoulder that soaked his flight suit with blood before Henderson even realized they'd been hit. The bomber started losing altitude. Not fast, just a steady drop that told Henderson their number 3 engine was dying and the hydraulics were damaged and they were falling out of formation whether he liked it or not. And here's the thing, this story gets even more insane, so if you're enjoying this, smash that subscribe button because we tell stories like this every single week, and trust me, you won't believe where this goes next. Henderson watched through his cockpit window as the rest of the formation continued on without them, 36 B-17s getting smaller and smaller as Hell's Angel fell behind, losing 500 feet every minute. They were 200 miles deep in Nazi Germany, alone, wounded, and about to find out what happened to bombers that couldn't keep up with the herd. Chen was gritting his teeth against the pain in his shoulder, using his good hand to help Henderson keep the plane level, when the radio crackled with a voice from the tail gunner. 40 Bf-109 fighters. Coming in fast. Like wolves who'd spotted a limping deer. What Henderson didn't know yet was that in the next 90 minutes, his crew would fight the longest continuous aerial battle of the entire war, that half their defensive guns would jam and leave them nearly defenseless, and that the Germans would make 67 separate attack runs on their crippled bomber while the crew improvised ways to survive that weren't in any training manual ever written. The Messerschmitt fighters came in from every direction, their yellow nose cones making them easy to spot against the blue sky, and Henderson counted at least 40 of them swarming around Hell's Angel like angry hornets. The top turret gunner, Sergeant Mike O'Reilly, opened fire first, his twin 50 caliber machine guns hammering out tracers that lit up the sky. The ball turret below the plane rotated, the tail gunner started shooting, and for about 30 seconds the B-17's defensive firepower was doing exactly what it was designed to do, creating an overlapping field of fire that made German pilots think twice about pressing their attacks. Then disaster struck in the worst possible way. An electrical fire started somewhere in the fuselage, sparking and smoking and filling the bomber with the smell of burning insulation, and before the crew could even grab a fire extinguisher, the entire electrical system shorted out. The intercom went dead. Just like that, Henderson lost all communication with his crew, couldn't tell them what to do, couldn't coordinate their defense, couldn't even know if they were still alive back there. But that wasn't the worst part. The electrical failure jammed 4 of their 8 defensive guns. O'Reilly's top turret froze in place, stuck pointing at empty sky where no German fighters were attacking. The ball turret partially seized up, leaving the gunner able to fire only one of his 2 guns and unable to rotate smoothly. The left waist gunner's weapon was completely destroyed, either from the flak hit or the electrical fire, just a twisted piece of metal that wouldn't shoot anymore. The tail gun jammed solid, wouldn't fire, wouldn't move, completely useless. Henderson didn't know any of this yet because without the intercom he was flying blind, just trying to keep the damaged bomber in the air while German fighters made attack runs every 45 seconds. What he didn't realize was that his crew was now defending a 4-engine bomber with exactly 4 working guns when the Germans thought they were facing 8, and that miscalculation was about to save their lives. The crew reacted the way you'd hope American airmen would react when everything goes wrong at the worst possible time. They improvised. O'Reilly, trapped in his frozen top turret, started rotating it manually using a hand crank that was designed for emergencies, each full rotation taking 20 seconds of hard muscle work while fighters screamed past at 300 miles per hour. The ball turret gunner, a kid from Texas named Bobby Martinez, realized his gun was overheating because it was doing the work of 2 guns now, so he started firing in carefully controlled 10-second bursts to keep the barrel from melting. The right waist gunner, Corporal James Wilson, looked over at his buddy whose gun was destroyed, made a decision that should have gotten him killed, and started running back and forth across the fuselage to cover both sides of the plane, sprinting between positions while the bomber rattled with hits and the thin aluminum floor offered zero protection from bullets. They developed hand signals because talking was impossible. Henderson would rock the wings to warn them fighters were coming from above. Chen, despite his wounded shoulder, would pound on the cockpit wall to signal fighters from below. The gunners created their own system, pointing and gesturing to coordinate their fire, making it up as they went because nobody had ever trained them for fighting a battle where you couldn't speak to the guy 10 feet away from you. The German pilots were relentless and professional and absolutely convinced they were about to score an easy kill. They'd make their attack runs in groups of 4 or 5, diving from above or swooping up from below, their 20mm cannons and machine guns tearing chunks out of Hell's Angel's wings and fuselage. Every attack run punched new holes in the bomber. Henderson could feel the impacts through the control yoke, could hear the sounds of metal tearing and glass shattering, could see pieces of his airplane getting blown off and tumbling through the sky behind them. The number 2 engine caught fire. Chen pulled the fire extinguisher controls and the flames died, but the engine was done, just windmilling in the slipstream. That left them flying on 2 engines, maybe 2.5 if you counted the damaged number 3 that was running rough and losing power every minute. But the B-17 Flying Fortress was built like a tank with wings, designed by Boeing engineers who understood that bombers would take damage and needed to absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. The airframe was ridiculously overbuilt, with redundant systems and structural reinforcement in critical areas, and as the German bullets punched 340 holes through the aluminum skin, the bomber just kept flying. Wings that should have folded stayed attached. Control surfaces that should have jammed kept responding. Landing gear that took direct hits stayed locked up in the wheel wells instead of dropping and creating drag. The 4 working guns kept firing. Wilson was running himself ragged, sprinting from the right waist position to the left and back again, his flight suit soaked with sweat despite the freezing air at altitude. Martinez in the ball turret was counting seconds in his head, firing his careful 10-second bursts and watching German fighters fill his gun sight and trying not to think about the fact that he was hanging in a glass bubble underneath a bomber that was getting shot to pieces. O'Reilly hand-cranked his turret degree by degree, making it rotate just fast enough to track targets, his arms burning with exhaustion but his gun never stopping. The bombardier, trapped in the nose section with Morrison's body and no working guns, was calling out fighter positions using hand signals to Henderson, giving the pilot some idea of where the next attack was coming from. The Germans made 67 separate attack runs over 90 minutes. Think about that. 67 times, groups of Bf-109 fighters dove on Hell's Angel, fired everything they had, and broke away. 67 times. The crew survived and kept fighting. The Americans shot down 7 German fighters, watched them spiral toward the ground trailing smoke and fire, and damaged 12 more badly enough that they broke off and limped home. But what made the difference, what actually saved the crew, was that the Germans never realized half the bomber's guns were jammed. They saw tracers coming from the tail and assumed the tail gun was firing when really those were ricochets or tracers from other guns. They avoided the top turret even when O'Reilly couldn't get it pointed at them because they'd been trained to fear that position. They made cautious approaches on the left side where Wilson's destroyed gun made them think they'd take fire when really that whole side was defenseless except for when Wilson could sprint over and shoot from that position. Henderson flew the crippled bomber with a touch so gentle it was almost art, nursing the dying engines, compensating for the damaged control surfaces, keeping them in the air through pure skill and determination. Chen worked the controls with one hand, his wounded shoulder useless but his spirit unbroken, calling out altimeter readings and airspeed because Henderson needed to focus on the Germans and couldn't watch every instrument. They lost altitude steadily, dropping from 28,000 feet to 20,000 to 15,000, and Henderson knew that if they went much lower they'd be in range of German anti-aircraft guns on the ground, which would finish what the fighters had started. After an hour and 20 minutes of continuous combat, something changed. The German attacks became less coordinated, more sporadic. Henderson didn't know why at first, but the reason was simple and beautiful. The Bf-109 fighters were running out of ammunition and fuel. They'd expected a 5-minute fight, maybe 10 at most, just long enough to overwhelm a crippled bomber and send it spinning into the German countryside. They hadn't planned for 90 minutes of combat against a crew that refused to die. At the 90-minute mark, the last German fighter made his final pass, fired his last rounds, and turned for home. Just like that, after an hour and a half of hell, the sky was empty. Henderson kept flying west, toward Allied lines that were still 100 miles away. They'd lost 2 engines completely, the third was running rough and coughing black smoke, and only the number 1 engine was still producing full power. The bomber was barely controllable, yawing to the right because of the dead engines on that side, every control input requiring both pilots to muscle the yoke. They crossed into Belgium at 8,000 feet, too low, too slow, but still flying. Henderson spotted a flat field that might work as a crash landing site if they were lucky and extremely skilled. He wasn't going to make it to a proper airfield. Hell's Angel was done. She'd given everything she had and it was time to put her down before she fell apart completely. The landing, if you could call it that, was controlled chaos. Henderson brought the bomber down with the gentlest touch he could manage, no landing gear because the hydraulics were shot, just belly landing the 40-ton aircraft into a Belgian farmer's field with 3 engines dead and every crew member bracing for impact. The B-17 hit the ground hard, skipped once, came down again, and slid for 300 yards while metal screamed and dirt flew and Henderson and Chen stood on the brakes even though they barely worked. When the bomber finally stopped moving, everything went quiet except for the ticking of cooling metal and the sound of men breathing hard because they were alive and couldn't quite believe it. Every crew member was wounded. Some worse than others, but every single man was bleeding from something, whether it was shrapnel or glass fragments or impacts from getting thrown around inside a bomber that was being shot to pieces. They climbed out through hatches and emergency exits, dropped onto Belgian soil, and looked back at Hell's Angel. The bomber looked like it had flown through a metal shredder. More than 200 bullet holes stitched across the wings and fuselage. Entire sections of the tail torn away. The nose section where Morrison had died was a mess of blood and shattered glass. 3 dead engines, 1 dying. But she'd brought them home. The post-battle inspection told the full story. 4 guns had defended them the entire fight. Not 8 like the Germans thought. Not even 6. Just 4 functioning weapons against 40 fighters making 67 attack runs over 90 minutes. The maintenance crews counted 340 bullet and cannon hits on the airframe. They found German rounds embedded in structural spars that had been hit but hadn't failed. They traced the electrical fire damage and realized the entire defensive battle had been fought without communication, without coordination, just American airmen making it up as they went and somehow making it work. The entire crew received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Henderson got a promotion and a recommendation for higher command. O'Reilly's arms were so sore from hand cranking that turret he couldn't lift them above his shoulders for a week. Martinez never forgot the feeling of counting seconds between bursts while fighters filled his gun sight. Wilson's legs were bruised from hip to ankle from running back and forth across that fuselage, but he'd covered both sides of the plane well enough that the Germans never figured out the left gun was destroyed. And Hell's Angel? The B-17 they said was too damaged to fly again? Boeing maintenance crews spent 6 weeks rebuilding her, replacing sections of wing and fuselage, installing new engines and guns and electrical systems. She flew 23 more missions before the war ended. 23 more times she brought her crew home. They retired her after V-Day with over 40 missions completed, more than 2,000 combat hours, and a reputation among B-17 crews as the bomber that wouldn't die. Henderson survived the war, went home to Sarah, and spent the rest of his life telling people that American engineering and American guts beat German fighters that day. Chen's shoulder healed enough for him to fly 12 more missions before rotating home. The crew stayed in touch after the war, meeting every few years to remember Morrison and talk about the day everything went wrong and they made it right through pure determination. By the end of World War II, Boeing had built over 12,000 B-17 flying fortresses, and they'd proven something the Germans never wanted to believe. American bombers could take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft. American crews could fight when everything was broken and communication was impossible, and American determination could win battles that looked hopeless on paper. Hell's Angel's 90-minute fight became legend in the 8th Air Force, the story that crews told each other before missions as proof that you could survive anything if you kept fighting and kept flying and absolutely refused to quit. Thanks for watching this incredible story from WW2 Vault. Next time we're covering the moment a single American tank crew held off an entire SS Panzer company for 6 hours with nothing but guts and an almost empty ammunition rack. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and we'll see you in the next one.